Historically, Armenia has long accused Azerbaijan of allegedly destroying or distorting historical inscriptions. Typically, these accusations follow the same algorithm. And now we have just a few minutes to tackle the daunting task of explaining the essence of the issue to our viewers. Well, that may sound impossible at first glimpse, but there is so much evidence. We have so many documents and statements by prominent people, scholars, that I think we can deal with it. And in a few minutes, it will become clear who has indeed been distorting and destroying historical artifacts. Let's start with Ilya Chavchavadze, who was a prominent Georgian public figure, very well known for his poems, as well as political and social essays. I'd like to read you a quote from his book, Armenian Scholars and Crying Stones. Exactly, he describes the stones as crying. The book was published in 1902 and described the algorithm of Armenian destructive acts. Quote, "There is plenty of evidence showing how Armenians have tried to erase and destroy the traces of Georgian origin on Georgian churches and monasteries, to scrape off or erase Georgian inscriptions from stones, to pluck them out of buildings and replace them with those bearing Armenian inscriptions. These facts have been covered in Russian and Georgian newspapers as well." End quote. Then he describes how Armenians, quote-unquote, discover these stones and present them as Armenian artifacts. Look how right Chavchavadze was in his foretelling the future. No wonder he's so much respected by his compatriots today. Just a few years ago, the Armenian Church officially requested the Georgian government to transfer to it 442 Georgian churches that they consider Armenian. You can easily find this information in the media. It's been discussed a lot. I'd also like to read you a letter sent to the Georgian Prime Minister on behalf of the Armenian Church. Quote, "Dear Irakli, the Armenian Apostolic Church has been active on the blessed land of Georgia since the 5th century. Let me pause here for a moment to make a remark. The very first statement in the letter is completely false. And I mean it based on the documentary evidence currently available at the Matenadaran Institute of Ancient Manuscripts in Yerevan. In the 20th century, the renowned Armenian scholar Jacob Papazian published 3 volumes of documentary evidence. One of them clearly indicates that the Armenian Church moved from Cilicia in southern Anatolia to the Uchkeltse village near present-day Yerevan in the 15th century. The village was later renamed to Echmiadzin. By the way, today they call it Vagarshapat, as a tribute to the area near the Euphrates River where they came from. In other words, Armenians, as always, dragged along geographical names too. This is how the Armenian Church appeared in the Caucasus. This is an undeniable fact, proving the emergence of Armenian churches in the region. Again, when they claim in the letter that the Armenian Apostolic Church has been active in Georgia since the 5th century, this very first sentence is completely false. Now I want to read you another passage from the letter. And this is what Chavchavadze asked his readers to be cautious about. Quote, "Based on the principles of Constitution, the rule of law and civil rights, I ask you to return the churches, both active and non-active monasteries, their ruins, as well as the land plots they stand on. And note, they cover an area of tens of square kilometers, or have previously been owned by the Georgian Diocese of the Armenian Apostolic Orthodox Saint Church. You can find in the appendix to this letter a list of 442 churches taken away from the Armenian Church." End of quote. This is exactly what Chavchavadze was warning us about. He said that Armenians erased original inscriptions from stones and replaced them with their own ones, so that they could later make claims about their Armenian origin. And the moment you start investigating the matter, Armenians will dig out the inscriptions Chavchavadze was referring to in his book, because they know where they hid them, in which part of these churches. They will happily show you these so-called Armenian inscriptions. This is what we have set out to prove. Please also note that Armenians want 442 churches back together with their land plots, which means tens of square kilometers. In other words, this letter is also an evidence of a territorial claim. As Chavchavadze wrote in his book, Armenians will dig out stones and present them as their own historical artifacts. Similar incidents have taken place not only in Azerbaijan, but in the whole Caucasus. Armenians call the Albanian churches as Armenian ones. They do the same in Georgia, with Georgian churches. So it's not only the Albanian churches that they call Armenian, but also the Georgian ones. Chavchavadze described a 100-year-old Armenian technology for erasing the Georgian inscriptions from stones and presenting their Armenian versions. It's surprising that a century later, these Nazi falsifiers continue to apply the same methods unchanged. It suffers to listen to the Armenian public figure and writer Onik Kardash quote, "If you walk along the streets of Shusha, take a look at buildings. When Armenians invaded the city, they brought along a batch of masons with them, who then scraped off all the Arabic inscriptions on buildings and public tap water fountains with their chisels. There are no Arabic inscriptions available in Shusha anymore." By the way, Russian scientist Nikolai Shavrov, who was directly involved in the colonization process back in the 19th, early 20th centuries, wrote about the same. Quote, "Thanks to extensive use of the practice of perjury, Armenians who had been known to be landless aliens have seized vast areas of state lands." End of quote. As we can see, it's the same thing Chavchavadze wrote about in his book. These stones are a true evidence of falsifications. And notice that I specifically quote famous people, and none of them is Azerbaijani. It helps create an absolutely clear and precise picture of the essence of the issue. Although Chavchavadze covered the facts related to the 19th century, we can see how they resonate with what we have today. During the liberation of Karabakh, a laboratory discovered in the Kalbajar district was full of allegedly ancient Armenian stone crosses that they call khachkars. In fact, they'd been artificially aged using a mixture of apple vinegar and various chemicals. After the treatment, the stones had been buried in the ground for some time before getting unearthed and presented as ancient Armenian crosses. This is what they did in the 21st century, using inorganic chemistry. In the 19th century, Armenian counterfeiters took advantage of organic chemistry instead. Here is another quote, this time from Metropolitan of Bethlehem, who discusses this fact with Archimandrite Porfiry Uspensky, a famous scholar specialized in Hellenic literature. "Do not ever trust Armenian documents, Father Archimandrite. Armenians are liars. They forge the documents and store them in the dung or wet places to get them aged, yellow and crumpled. Animal manure is a corrosive medium. Back in the day, they used organic chemistry. Today, they use inorganic stuff. Different ages, different people, but they talk about the same thing. But that's not all. Let's continue with quotes. Here is another one from an outstanding scholar Boris Piotrovsky, who was the father of the current director of the Hermitage, Mikhail Piotrovsky. Piotrovsky Sr. was also a director of the Hermitage, and he was a scholar acknowledged worldwide. Now look what he writes, also about the stones, by the way. In addition to drawings of the 19th century BC high coins, Mkrtchyan's article The Mystery of Metsamor, published in English in the Czechoslovak magazine New Orient, issue number 3, page 16, 1967, also contains the photos of these coins. Below is the expert report based on the analysis of these coins by the Department of Numismatics of the Armenian Historical Museum. Quote, "Presenting the coins in the New Orient magazine as currency units of the 19th century BC is completely false. In fact, they were minted in the 12th, 13th century Common Era by Azerbaijani Atabeks of the Ildigizid dynasty, although inscriptions on them had been erased. Such coins have been widespread in medieval Armenia and certain regions of Transcaucasia." End of quote. So Armenians presented the coins of the Azerbaijani Ildigizid dynasty as those of the 19th century BC, as ancient Armenian coins. This is nothing but a fraud spanning more than 3,000 years. The same is true for the 17th century BC high inscriptions, allegedly found on stones and rocks of Metsamor. The article published in the Journal of the Academy of Sciences of the Armenian SSR, Earth Sciences, Volume 17, 6, page 80, provides an image of the so-called Metsamor hieroglyph and a piece of accompanying text translated as follows. quote, "the lavishly decorated house of fire. Twice blessed is Jacob, to whom belongs forever the land of spring." End of quote. Yet, according to the conclusion of experts in Arab studies of the Institute of History of the Academy of Sciences, the artifact is in fact a tombstone with an Arabic inscription, albeit copied inaccurately, and reads Ali, Qasim Khan. And fair enough, it reads not from left to right, as Ayvazyan believed, but vice versa, from right to left. You see, sometimes they erased inscriptions, sometimes they preferred to age stones by keeping them in harsh environment, or they simply read the found inscriptions from left to right, instead of reading them from right to left, as Arabic scripts are supposed to be read. Let me read you one more quote from another person who lived in the 19th century too. It also resonates with the previous quotes. This one is taken from Bishop Cyprian's book called Cultural Role of Iberia in the History of Rus. They, meaning Armenians, can fake manuscripts and preserve them in damp cellars. These documents will then be found by an expert of ancient manuscripts and discussed in a printed article accompanied by an extensive foreword and an afterword. Armenian scribes are true masters of such tricks. As you can see, Cyprian actually said the same thing as Ilya Chavchavadze. Armenians first bury the stones and then make a big deal about their findings, presenting them as sensational. Now let's talk about how the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia started. Let's talk about Armenian manipulations with historical memory and inscriptions. We've seen the evidence provided by Chavchavadze and other scholars about how Armenians erased inscriptions, replaced them, and so on. In fact, it all started when Armenians erased one of the main inscriptions in Karabakh, the one on the monument called Maraga 150. It was installed in 1978 to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the resettlement of first Armenians from Maraga region in present-day Iran to Karabakh. The monument had an inscription in Armenian reading Maraga 150. The incident took place 10 years before the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. 10 years later, in 1988, when Armenians expressed their intention to join Karabakh to Armenia, they immediately erased the inscription. The monument itself survived, but it was kind of silenced after the inscription was removed. It was only 10 years old. This was followed by a series of similar acts of forgery and manipulation with all the monuments located in Karabakh. Researcher Faig Ismailov has studied these facts extensively. His observations are valuable, as he had eyewitnessed the monuments before the occupation, during the Soviet period. Faig is an avid fan of ancient monuments, and he has also seen the state of these monuments after the occupation. We can find many facts of falsification in the Armenian sources as well. Interestingly, they took photos of the process. Suppose there is an ancient building from the 18th century. Let's say they decided to turn it into a church. Here is what they do step by step. They build a bell tower, clear the ground for burials, bring in gravestones from somewhere, and refurbish the interiors of the church to be. Here you go, an easy-peasy recipe for an ancient Armenian church. We have all the photos covering the process in its entirety. Here is a selected few from the footage collected by Faig Ismailov. Let's now flash forward from the 19th century to the 21st century. Soon after the liberation of Karabakh in 2020, we were anxious to examine the so-called archaeological site of Tigranakert. As you probably know, when Armenians occupied Agdam, so-called Armenian scientists and archaeologists announced that they found the traces of ancient Tigranakert there. But even the serious Armenian scholars were skeptic about the finding, wondering why the archaeologists believed it was Tigranakert. We were keen to know this as well. So one of our historians, Rizvan Husseinov, set off for Agdam right away. We then discovered that the site, referred to as a historical site of Tigranakert, in fact was hosting a bunch of medieval Azerbaijani baths. But Armenians had populated the area with some crosses, khachkars, and redecorated everything. They've done a pretty good job there. Unfortunately, we have to admit that the number of people who know all these facts, mainly scientists and public figures, is many times less than the number of people who have been deceived thanks to fake Armenian articles and statements published online. On the one hand, there are millions of people who have been deceived by Armenians, and only a small group of scholars, even in Armenia itself, who are well aware of these fakes, and they know that the whole story is not as it's described. All these acts of manipulation presented in our film are a crime against the world community and violate the Second Protocol of the Hague Convention of 1954 for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, adopted on March 26, 1999. Article 9 of the protocol clearly states that, quote, "A party in occupation of the whole or part of the territory of another party shall prohibit and prevent, in relation to the occupied territory, any illicit export, other removal or transfer of ownership of cultural property, any archaeological excavation, save where this is strictly required to safeguard, record or preserve cultural property, any alteration to or change of use of cultural property which is intended to conceal or destroy cultural, historical or scientific evidence, any archaeological excavation of, alteration to or change of use of cultural property in occupied territory, shall, unless circumstances do not permit, be carried out in close cooperation with the competent national authorities of the occupied territory." End of quote. Our film provides evidence for a complete set of criminal acts listed in the above protocol. We can find evidence of illicit export and other removal, archaeological excavations of so-called Tigranakert, as well as alteration of cultural property, including falsifications using chemical agents, aging of artifacts, and so on. So in general, everything is against the Hague Protocol, specifically Article 9 of the document. By the way, you can find all these quotes in my new book called Fake Busters. I've collected statements made by hundreds of scholars, none of whom is Armenian or Azerbaijani. Specifically, there is a whole chapter with statements made by internationally recognized scholars of Armenian origin who are against the official Armenian historiography. I mean, they are normal, true scholars. I'm sure that all this drama will be over pretty soon, and it will be funny to look back at all these fakes and falsifications, these so-called ancient artifacts treated with acids and dung. We'll laugh at them, because during the liberation of occupied lands, we have discovered laboratories teeming with physical evidence, which confirm the facts written about in the 19th century. These facts are in full compliance with what we see today.